Okay, everybody, I would like to give you a warm welcome to this 17th webinar of the Outcome Harvesting community. This time it will be on the updated guide to outcome harvesting and attitude change. My name is Connie Hoytink. I'm an independent consultant based in the Netherlands, and I'm one of the 3 facilitators of this outcome harvesting community, and doing that together with Goele Scheers. Goele, can you say hi?
Hi everyone, good to
Yeah.
see you all here. So I'm indeed one of the community facilitators specialized in outcome harvesting, working with it since the very beginning. So
Yeah.
looking forward to this webinar.
Based in Belgium, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have Carmen as our facilitator. Where are you, Carmen?
I'm here. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Carmen Wilson Grau. I'm based in Guatemala. And as Connie mentioned, one of the outcome harvesting community facilitators.
Thank you. Before we start, just a few notes. One, if you are interested to present yourselves in a webinar here, you are most welcome to do so and write to us. We're always interested to hearing new stories and learn more. And also, if you haven't done that yet, please join our community through the forum page on our outcomeharvesting.net website. Then, practically speaking, we are many, or we may be many, so please stay muted during the presentation. You can write your questions in the chat, and we hope to answer them all in the 25 minutes plenary. If we do not manage that, we will try to answer the questions afterwards and share them in our online community. This webinar will be recorded for sharing on our website. Well, it has been my real pleasure to be part of the team working on this guide. And for more details, I now hand over to Michelle, who will further introduce herself and the rest of the team. Enjoy, Michelle.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Michelle Garrett, and I lead Ripple Peace Research and Consulting, which is based in Seattle in the USA, and honored to be sharing with you today in the company of my team our update on outcome harvesting plus attitude change, which is an adaptation of outcome harvesting that provides a way for you to meaningfully incorporate attitude change while at the same time upholding outcome harvesting's behavior-centered core principles. What we aim to do today is share some learnings from the newly revised guide to outcome harvesting plus attitude change, which is a very collaborative experience-based update of the 2020 trial version that was published by Tier Fund. On the theme of collaboration, I'm actually thrilled to see a lot of collaborators have joined us today. Many of you have provided feedback that have shaped the learning, so bravo and thanks for being here. In terms of our simple agenda, what we'd like to do in the next half hour is share some information about why we add attitude change to OH, how we add attitude change to OH in ways that uphold the OH core principles, and what are the latest technical learnings that are reflected in the new guide. We will have after that about 25 minutes for open discussion at the end. Today's presenters, in addition to myself, will be Dr. Barbara Klugman and Melika Rafai. As you know, we're being moderated by Connie Hoytink, and it's important to mention that the 4 of us make up about half of the Outcome Harvesting plus Attitude Change Advisory team. And we want to give a shout out to the 4 other members, including Min Ma, who co-authored the guide, Jeff Matthias, JL Dharamsingh, and Lydia Powell. Jumping right into the first bit of content on why we add attitude change to outcome harvesting. There are really 2 ways to think about this. One is thinking about the role of attitudes and how they matter in creating social change. You are probably familiar with the visual on the left of the slide, which is a visual metaphor that allows us to look at a complex adaptive system as an iceberg. What we can see above the waterline are events, and some of the underlying human behavior patterns. What we cannot see deep below the surface are the mental models, or in other words, in OH plus AC language, the attitudes that are driving behavior. Systems theorists often tell us that the mental models or attitudes are sometimes the most strategic place to intervene when programming for systems change. So, important to be aware of that. And given the importance of attitudes in programming, it is no surprise that attitudes can also be important in OH. OH is a very behavior-centered approach, and we are committed to keeping it that way. Yet, we've learned that attitude change data can add a great deal of value under two types of circumstances. One of those circumstances is when attitude change is essential to achieving the program results, right? In other words, attitudes are central to the program's theory of change, whether that's been articulated or not. And the other circumstance being when attitudes are central to the worldview of the program implementers or the social actors who are involved. In that case, AC data, when you hear me say AC, I mean attitude change, and I'll check that acronym as many times as needed. In that case, attitude change data can be important for ensuring multicultural validity, meaning the aim of maintaining alignment with the cultural context as a core criterion for the rigor of the evaluation. One last thought on this before we jump into Barbara's examples. Wanted to share with you some samples of what attitude changes might sound like, drawn from our own experience, just to prime the pump a bit. You can see here, one of those examples says, I always thought that those people were so different, but after eating dinner together, I realized that we have a lot in common. The one at the bottom is particularly interesting, saying the one negative is that it was difficult for him to go from our workshop space back to his day-to-day life, since we became like a family during the program. Particularly interesting one because it illustrates that not all attitude changes are intended or positive, and because you can begin to see what a collective attitude change might look like. With those examples to prime the pump, I'm going to hand you over to Barbara, who's going to share some examples from her own personal experience in terms of why attitude change matters in OH. Over to you, Barbara.
Oh, the host would like me to unmute, but I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm a freelance strategy and evaluation practitioner in South Africa. I also coordinate the Outcome Harvesting community's blogs. As a long-time outcome harvesting practitioner, I love its focus on what changed, who did what differently, and whether an initiative's strategies are making progress towards social change or social transformation. However, I found that sometimes it doesn't tell a full enough story of the process of change. I'm currently working with HomeNet International, a network of regional and national organizations of home-based workers. While HomeNet International decided to use outcome harvesting as its monitoring approach, once we were in conversation with its members about if and how their strategies were achieving their intended behavior change outcomes, they emphasized the significance of home-based workers shifting their self-perception from being homemakers to being workers. So HomeNet International decided to document and categorize such changes in self-perception rather than ignoring this positive and necessary step in winning rights for workers. And to do this in the regions where organizing is nascent, and so there isn't yet a big movement. It decided to document such internal shifts, to categorize them, and to use that process to ask what next? How will we follow up with workers who've shifted perspective to see if and how they subsequently took action? And this really was an action to honor the perspectives of the workers and to deepen our understanding of the process of change. So the advantage is that once this is in the database, we can link back to any subsequent outcomes to these shifts, which will give insights into causal pathways towards change over time, to understand the interactions between attitude change and behavior change. It's taken me quite a long time to be comfortable with giving this attention to internal shifts. My concern was shaped in part by my years as a funder at the Ford Foundation, where I frequently received requests for funds to do trainings without any substantive evidence as to what changes beyond knowledge or attitudes these trainings were influencing, and without groups including plans to follow up with trainees in order to see if the trainees influenced or enabled them to do things differently. Indeed, I first met Ricardo Wilson Grau when he was asked to do an outcome harvesting evaluation with an international women's rights network. He liked to work with a content expert, and they suggested me because I'd worked on issues of gender and women's rights for years. So we did some getting to know each other, found we had shared values, and embarked on the evaluation together. We had a dreadful experience. The overall evaluation findings were actually very positive, showing all sorts of outcomes they had influenced through research dissemination and campaigns, amongst other things. But we could not identify outcomes from the innumerable trainings they'd undertaken. They were appalled and lashed out because of this. From where I sit now, I think we might have ameliorated their horror if we'd included in our findings what evidence there was of shifts in perspective and attitudes and understanding amongst training participants. In that way, acknowledging the effectiveness of the training at that level. And this may have made them more open to a conversation about the value going forward of documenting and interrogating if and in what ways such attitude changes did or did not lead to the behavior change that they assumed. This would have been a more useful evaluation approach, enabling them to strengthen their work. So where have I got to with these conundrums? Particularly when evaluating training programs and fellowship programs, I now ask people to tell stories in whatever way is meaningful for them. And out of this, I record both internal shifts and shifts in their behavior, as well as how the things the programs do or the things that the fellows do influence the actions of others. Analyzing this with fellowship program organizers and participants helps to unpack what the fellowship or training experience has contributed and to use that to consider what needs strengthening or retaining in the program. So I thought I'd end by sharing a story of one person, Bulela Vava, with his permission, who was a fellow in a cohort of Tekano Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity in South Africa. And this shows how this approach elucidated the interactions of attitudes and outcomes. By way of background, his experience of the Fellows Program, during his experience, Bulela identified a gap, the absence of an organizing mechanism for oral health practitioners, dentists, and related professionals to advocate for rural oral health services. And he made this the focus of his project. The fellowship program's contribution was that it ran modules and processes to build fellows' confidence, their ability to listen to others, their ability to use storytelling for change, while also building solidarity and trust among fellows. In describing his journey and what it enabled him to establish the Public Oral Health Forum, Bulela emphasized that his willingness to listen increased. Also, he said, learning to step back, listening and humility, and allowing people to have space to share their views, and then being able to come into that space. Learning to accept alternate views with respect, actually, and learning to create room for all these to actually coexist. He developed confidence in playing a leadership role, whereas before he was intimidated when engaging professionals more senior in the career ladder. He learned how to tell a story. In his words, because I need to build a movement, I need to build a message, but I need to innovate the message. I've got a nice hashtag on one of my self-made t-shirts, "Your smile matters." This learning shifted how Bulela acted, hence the outcomes. his greater humility and respect for others led him to seek advice from another fellow, a leader of an organization of sex workers, who walked Bulelo through the basics of organizing, building, and sustaining a membership organization. Drawing on his greater confidence and listening skills, he networked and organized meetings of oral health people. And these outcomes in turn influenced others. 52 oral health professionals came together and planned to establish the Public Oral Health Forum. And by the end of 2020, 2 years later, 150 oral health professionals had become members, and it had established a board and an elected national council. And in fact, it's gone from strength to strength. If you look on social media, you'll see them there. In addition, others recognized Bulelo's leadership. The Young Dentists Council elected him as their vice president. And in 2022, a provincial government invited him onto their steering committee to develop their oral health strategy. All of these experiences have in turn shifted some of his attitudes, his sense of self, and his lesson learning on his leadership style. So this has been my journey. Only now, having worked with the team on the new edition of the guide, have I resolved how actually to embed this approach in my practice and sort of develop the confidence to do that in a systematic way, which has been a very exciting journey for me. And Michelle and Malaka will describe what I mean. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. On to Michelle, I guess. You're muted, Michelle.
Thank
There
you.
you
That's
go.
always trouble with muting, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Barbara, for those amazing illustrations of why attitude change data matters in your OH experience, and for being so open in sharing your journey. We're going to jump in now to a moment of describing how we add attitude change to OH while upholding the OH core principles. We really are committed to those OH core principles, which creator Ricardo Wilson Grau asked us to do when making adaptations, because he knew that those principles are what made outcome harvesting. So let's take a quick look at this probably familiar tree diagram, which includes the outcome harvesting or OH steps in the leaves and the OH core principles at the root. There is only one core principle that is at risk when you're adding AC data, but it is a big one. And that is principle number 7, which says formulate an outcome as an observable change. Observable change means a change in behavior or action, and that is such a big part of what gives OH its power and its rigor. At the same time, attitude changes clearly take place inside a person, so you cannot observe them with your eyes. So how then can we add attitude change data to OH without violating the core principles? We've learned so far 3 key steps to making this possible. First, and most importantly, we work with really very clear distinctions between what is an outcome and what is an attitude change. We, in OH plus AAC, would not ever consider an attitude change to be an outcome. Despite its great importance, we would not consider the attitude change to be an outcome. For added clarity, we refer to the outcome as a behavior change. We say exactly what outcome harvesting means by calling the outcome a behavior change, which is therefore easily understood as distinct from an attitude change. The attitude change is defined as a non-observable change in a range of internal aspects, including perceptions, emotions, opinions, knowledge, assumptions, beliefs, values, and even spirituality and worldview. It's a broad catch-all term borrowed from social psychology, where it is used to study the interrelationships between attitudes and behavior, just as we do in OH plus AC. Secondly, in terms of how we add attitude change into OH, we are very careful in how we do the data collection to add the attitude change data as a new component within the outcome statement. That outcome statement format is probably familiar to you. And if it is, you can see that the green column is the added attitude change data, and it is new. In this way, the inclusion of the attitude change data is not changing anything that already exists in OH. It's just adding something extra. Okay. Thirdly, and finally, the last key point on how we have learned to add attitude change data into OH while upholding the core principles is to develop a very clear concept and analytical framework for how attitudes and behaviors interrelate within a social change process. If you look at the circular loop in the middle of this diagram, you will see that ACs and BCs influence each other mutually, particularly seeing that ACs do influence or catalyze BCs, as everyone expects, and perhaps less intuitively, that BCs can also influence ACs. I'm going to pause here for just a second because I know a number of new colleagues have joined us and they might need a refresher on our acronyms. So ACs are attitude changes, BCs are behavior changes. The mutual influence between those BCs and ACs can become a feedback loop or a spiral. Additionally, you will note at the bottom of the diagram that there is no direct line between attitude change and social change more broadly defined. As important as attitude change is, there is no social change that can happen without behavior change, right? So that arrow goes only from behavior change to social change. And this is why it's so important to continue to center behavior change within the OH process. With those little bits in mind in terms of how we do OH plus AC, I'm going to hand you over to Melika for an example of how she's done this in her own experience, in this case in Egypt. Over to you, Melika.
Thank you, Michelle. Greetings, everybody. My name is Melika. I'm a freelance peace building and OH plus AC consultant, currently based in Florida. This example, though, was from my time when I was working in Egypt. I was first introduced to OH plus AC through happenstance when I was based in Egypt. A former colleague needed an evaluator who he could trust, and that trust was far more important to him than finding an expert. And in that experience, I immediately fell in love with the storytelling aspect of OH plus AC. And I focused more on collecting the stories and pulling out the changes. And because of the Egyptian context, the attitudes came out naturally. And in this experience I'm sharing, it's focused on a Catholic Relief Services evaluation. They were wanting to take a look at their interfaith peacebuilding portfolio, which was over the span of 9 years in 4 governorates, the ones that are circled, Minya, Asyut, Sohag, and Loksur. And it was through the course of 5 interfaith peacebuilding projects. To paraphrase one of the objectives of the evaluation that's specific to our conversation, the aim was to identify behavior and attitude shifts conducive to intergroup coexistence and the sustainability of those shifts. The projects, as well as the evaluation, engaged youth, religious, and community leaders, as well as mothers. Unfortunately, for my experience in the evaluation, I wasn't able to directly engage the mothers as much as I would like, so these stories are more from youth and religious and community leaders. Next slide, please, Michelle. As I had mentioned, speaking about attitudes, it seems to come more naturally. And it can sort of be a springboard to identify behavior changes. The attitudes, they can't be assumed either. And in a few examples I'm going to share, I can go into why we can't assume those changes. So these two examples are youth examples that came up. There was a young female journalist, and after participating in the Interfaith Peacebuilding Project, she spoke up about a longstanding issue that was dividing her professional community. This issue existed before she participated in the project, and she never said anything. And then after participating, she ended up speaking up and working to bridge this divide that was between Muslim and Christian colleagues. There was another young Muslim man who ended up stepping in to resolve a conflict between a Muslim and a Christian neighbor. And he had shared before participating in the project, he would have never done something like that. And he just would have been too terrified, really thinking about what the community, his Muslim community, would have said about him. And so the assumed AC, if we hadn't gone into the conversation, would be that they both experienced an increase of tolerance in the quote unquote other. But after having the conversation, there was actually an increase in confidence. The project gave them the tools and the knowledge that made them feel they could speak up. I had heard this increase in confidence before from other youth in previous evaluations in Egypt. And through that, it suggests future programming would continue to engage youth. It would continue to give them decision-making power and to continue bringing them together with religious and community leaders. Because in day-to-day life, they don't have that opportunity to speak up. They don't have that opportunity to see their community values their voice. And so through the project and focusing on getting them to work together, the attitude that led to them doing the tolerance or the coexistence, the language that's used in a lot of interfaith peacebuilding program, the attitude that actually shifted was an increase in confidence. Another example, Michelle, next slide, please, was seen through a young Muslim religious leader in another project. In many of these interfaith peacebuilding programs that were a part of this evaluation, there was a lot of buddying up of Muslim and Christian religious leaders or Muslim and Christian youth. And so for this Muslim religious leader, he was buddied up with a Protestant pastor. And through participating in the project, he engages with this pastor more that's within his physical community. And after the project ended, he appreciated this relationship with the Protestant pastor. So he continued to work with him. He continued to nurture the friendship. And he saw that the Protestant pastor was also engaging with him in the same positive way. And learning more about the other community, he ended up changing his sermon rhetoric to pray for the whole community, not just for his Muslim congregation. And this is especially significant because in many Egyptian communities, the Friday sermon, there is a loudspeaker that's attached to the mosque. So the entire geographic community hears the sermon. So it's not just his Muslim congregation that's hearing this, it's the entire community. And so without engaging more, one could assume that the attitude change was adopting ideas of coexistence. But in talking with him further, it was actually an increase in the sense of responsibility to his geographic community. This was just one instance of a young Muslim leader. Those project partners that were in that governorate, they ended up deciding to continue to engage young religious leaders to see if that sort of change would continue by engaging with those people with that sect or makeup. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future with that engagement. And if we take a broader look, if Michelle, next slide, please, sorry. This is a composite pattern, and it's just sort of bringing together a lot of things that I heard both in this evaluation as well as other former colleagues and project participants that I had stayed in touch with. And since these projects in this evaluation, there were many participants who began with the very first project and they continued participating. And so there was a difference in hearing from those participants that were there from the very beginning and the participants who were maybe just involved with one of the peace building projects. And so an initial AC that might come out of participating is amazing. We're all the same. There's no difference between Muslims and Christians. And then after joining the second peace building project, maybe they end up celebrating a holiday together. And through that holiday celebration, there's another attitude change that, wait, actually we're different. Because you see the holiday celebrations, you understand more about the different religions. And then through that AC, there's a deeper relationship, because to understand those religious differences, there has to be proximity between people. And so they begin to organize independently with neighbors, for example. And then finally, through that continued relationship, there's a recognition and an honor of the differences between the relationships. So these understandings, they go deeper, and personal views may be challenged throughout this process. For me, this is an oversimplification, but it really shows how giving space for attitude changes and really asking questions about it allows us to give a greater understanding to the various journeys that occur throughout the projects. Thank you. Back to you, Michelle.
Melika, thanks so much for that really nuanced example of how attitude changes and behavior changes interacted in that evaluation. Really appreciate it. We have one more little section left on sharing some of the latest technical learnings. I'm going to selectively shorten this a bit for the sake of time to make sure we have lots of discussion, but nonetheless, there are a few bits here that you'll probably want to know about. So hitting the highlights. When we talk about the latest technical learnings, we're really referring to the key things that we've learned between the publication of the 2020 trial version toolkit and the 2024 guide. So some of the new things that we've learned that are reflected in the new guide include, first of all, some learnings about the process of learning. Learnings about the process of learning outcome harvesting plus attitude change. And what we've come to see is that for evaluators, I think all of us in this audience are evaluators in some form or another. And for folks like us, it's very highly recommendable to gain some experience with basic outcome harvesting, mainstream outcome harvesting, before taking the additional step of learning to add in the attitude changes. This is because there are some really big paradigm shifts that are involved just simply in learning OH, right? And we need time to adapt to those new ways of working before adding in complicated adaptations, such as including ACs. So we have redesigned the guide and most of our training processes to reflect that learning. Secondly, we've also discovered through ongoing experience the two key enabling conditions for adding in attitude change data to outcome harvesting. One of them is that the evaluation team capacity in the form of additional time and skills essentially needs to increase, right? You need more time and capacity within your team, which is probably easy to understand, but it has big implications. And secondly, perhaps less intuitively, you need to have an ability to communicate directly with some or all of the social actors influenced by the program. The reason for that is that you cannot observe their attitude changes with your eyes. So the only way you can verify those attitude changes, right? Think back to Melika's example about the fact that you can't assume what attitude changes are taking place, right? The only way you can really verify those attitude changes is to hear directly from the people who experience them. And it requires some planning ahead to ensure that that direct communication takes place. We've also made some significant progress over the last few years in how we analyze OH plus AC data, how we adapt OH analytical techniques that many of you are probably already using to incorporate that attitude change data. When it comes to creating outcome chain diagrams, outcome maps, they go by different names. But as you know, they are so useful for illustrating the process of how one change can lead to another over time. We've been using these diagrams since the beginning of OH plus AC, but we recently discovered that there are actually at least 2 different ways to do it. The first option, which you currently see in front of you, shows the ACs, which are blue, as being linked directly to the BCs, which are green. This approach is helpful for emphasizing the centrality of the BCs, the behavior change, within the social change process, just as we do when we're writing up the BC statement. On the other hand, this alternative option for creating the BC chain diagram shows the ACs and the BCs as separate entities, although they're interrelated. You can see the ACs as blue circles and the BCs as green rectangles. This approach is possible only when your attitude change data is precise enough to determine the sequence of interactions between the ACs and the BCs so that you know which came first. And it's useful if you want to see an even more nuanced understanding, right, of how those ACs and BCs interact with each other in the process of social change. There are some more analytical learnings. We can come back to them in the Q&A if you like, but I don't want to damage that discussion time. So I'm going to jump to the last point, which is inviting you to get involved. There are multiple ways to do this. And when I say involved, I really mean involved. It's a collaborative learning process that's ongoing, right? So if you want to shape the next phase of learnings, you can join us. As initial steps, you can download the guide. You can also request periodic updates just to stay informed about OH plus AC. I believe Connie is putting these links into the chat window for you now.
I am.
At a more active level, if you want to engage in exchanging learnings with other OH plus AC practitioners, you can join our Google group, right? Active OH plus AC Practitioners Unite. Join us in that Google group. Or you can reach out to any of our advisory team members and chat if you know them. We named everyone at the beginning and their names are listed again here. We want to encourage conversation among all. So with that, Connie, I hand it back to you.
Thank you.
Guide us in the discussion and the Q&A.
Yeah. I've tried to keep tracks. Thank you so much to all 3 of you, Malika, Barbara, and Michelle, of course. I've got a set of very interesting, intriguing questions that came across. The first one might have been answered, but I'd rather give you the floor to do that. The first question comes from Ponga. Hi, Ponga. Happy to have you here. Who's saying, if attitude change is only an addition to the outcome statement, how would we independently determine that attitude change is the contribution to the outcome, given that we've already said that our attitude change is not in itself an outcome? That was the first question. I see thinking voices. Who can I give the floor for this question?
I'm happy to jump in as the least experienced one of the
Please
team.
do.
The
Please
only
do.
one I'm going to have any comment about. But hi, Ponge.
Barbara.
Is that okay? Oh,
it's okay. It's just that you are the one teaching us never to apologize.
Oh,
go ahead.
I'm sure you've had the experience that often when people describe the journey they intermix these things entirely. So they actually make the links between the two. And then with outcome harvesting, I've tended to sort of leave that part of the story aside. So in that way, what I found myself doing now is noting all such changes, but when an attitude change is mentioned in relation to the story about the behavior change, then I tie them together. So that's kind of how I do it. I mean, it's that word independently of yours that I think is a great challenge, because of course it's a self-perception. And so nobody else can say, yes, for sure, that attitude changed. Although I'm sure I've certainly seen, for example, in evaluating leadership programs, often somebody else working on a project with a fellow will say, I've seen them really shift their thinking or their feelings, or, but it's not the same in that way. And this might relate to the question, I think, that Carmen raised also about substantiation. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Barbara. Ponga, did it answer your question?
Connie, can I jump in on that?
Thanks, Barbara. I think you've answered my question.
Okay, good. Michelle, you want to add, or okay for now we move on to the next question?
Actually, this good question and Barbara's excellent answer, thank you, Barbara, relate to some of the relatively new learnings that have come up in OH plus AC. One is, again, that learning on the importance of verifying the AC directly with the person who experienced it, right? And the second component of that is making sure that we also ask and explore in that person's experience, what was the timing of the AC in relation to the behavior change, right? So that we can begin to get a sense of whether that attitude change catalyzed the behavior change or whether it was the other way around, right? And that goes a long way towards verifying that data, along with, of course, substantiating your overall outcome statements where warranted.
Thanks, Michelle. This takes us right to the next question. So thanks for that little bridge from Carmen, actually, who is asking that when identifying attitude changes as part of the outcome statement, an additional part, are these also considered when substantiating the outcomes? And if so, how? Substantiating attitude change. Michelle, ready to? Malaka, you're also welcome to join in for a change. Go ahead, Malaka.
Michelle, feel free to jump in and add to it. So for the CRS Egypt example that I used, part of the reason we weren't able to use as much of the attitude change data I collected was because substantiation comes from engaging with the person who experienced the attitude change. So that's why we say we're exploring the attitude instead of substantiating and defining it. I think also the attitude change, it gives more depth to the behavior change, since we see how there's oftentimes, in my experience, a behavior change may have occurred with several different people, but each of them has a different attitude that was linked to that behavior change. But that substantiation, or understanding more about the attitude, it has to come from engaging with that person who experienced the attitude change.
Thank you, Malaka. Just to continue with you, Malaka, there was a specific question from Ponga to you, asking, when designing the outcome harvest, is it possible to come up with assumed change and then track to see the actual change in the process of project implementation? So how you had this assumed change versus the real attitude change. Is that something you take into account in the design?
Putting the assumed change on the slides was just to demonstrate how the attitude change, we have to engage with the actual person that experienced it to learn about it. I think a lot of what is in the assumed change would go in the significance column, since it's sort of like the assumed change is how it affects everybody else. Whereas that attitude change is that internal attitude change. And I also I feel like we're tracking enough as it is. There's no need to, to add the assumed change to it. But I think a lot of what would come from the assumed change would go in the significance. Michelle, feel free to add, because I know you also wanted to address something from that previous question.
I think just to reiterate the importance of what you're saying, Melika, about avoiding the assumption that we know what the attitude change is, because that actually happens so much in programming and sometimes even in OH practice. We make those assumptions. And so your examples are golden in terms of pointing out why, why we can't assume and why we need to verify. So wanted to flag that because of its importance for the group. Back to you, Connie.
Yeah, thank you. There's questions from Stephen and from Brett. Stephen starts with, he said very interestingly, in my work with clients, I use the 3H model, like head, heart, and hands, or other alliterations like attitudes, affections, and actions, or even beliefs, belonging, behavior. Very nice. Thank you, Stephen. However, how would this community define attitude change using this 3H model? Is it a head-only function, like on worldview or mindset, or does it also include an emotional component?
I can definitely take that because I'm experiencing it right now as I experiment with some new ways of training local data collectors for OH plus AC. And I have been using that same head, heart, hands metaphor, but in OH plus AC, I would consider that both the head and the heart fall under attitude change, right? The head and the heart are both attitude change, and then the hands are the behavior change. That's been working well in those trainings in my experience. I'd be interested to chat more about that offline and see how it works for our colleagues as well.
Can I jump in for a moment, Connie?
Yeah, sure.
On that, it was actually a conversation we had yesterday when we were preparing for this, is that, Stephen, I use the head, heart, hands, or I work with groups that use head, heart, hands, and I tend to include the hands also in what here we're calling attitude change, if they're talking about knowing how to do something. By now I've got more skills in this or that, but until they demonstrate the skill, I don't put it into the outcomes side. So I use all three in what here we're calling attitudes.
Thanks, Barbara, for the addition. Is that clear, Stephen, or you want to comment on that?
Maybe if Michelle could just elaborate, I could see where it'd be very helpful on the training side, but what does it work when you're with a group of mango farmers under a tree in Western Kenya, and you're like, they're not necessarily going to make this head heart sort of or it's just going to come out. And so we still want to divide things in some ways. And so an attitude change, have you been playing with this, Michelle, on the teams that you're evaluating, and how are they understanding those distinctions?
Stephen, are you talking about training team members who are doing data collection, or doing direct
data collection, from
yes, that would be a different thing, and I'm glad you asked. One thing we learned really early on is to not ask social actors to distinguish between behavior change and attitude change. We did try that at first, it seemed natural. These are the categories that we're working with in our heads. So we initially tried bringing that into data collection. And as you might expect, it really didn't work because most people don't think in those terms. And as the social actors, they don't need to. So we just approach those data collection conversations by asking questions about what has changed, right? Asking the question broadly. And of course, there are a million different ways to phrase it, you know, but asking what has changed. And then it's our job as the evaluation team, right, to identify where are the behavior changes in the story that emerges, where are the attitude changes, and how do we, you know, further probe and explore in order to write those up as an outcome statement. Does that make sense? I'm really glad you asked that.
Thanks, Michelle. A few questions pending. Brett is asking, actually quite different type of question, saying there are accepted methodologies for measuring things like attitude change, for example, the Likert scale. Do you consider using any of these in this work on attitude change? A Likert scale, or maybe if you would like have some explanation from Brett. You want Brett to speak to this, or?
Actually, the question is clear to me, but I wonder, I wonder if we should just unpack for a moment for everyone what is the Likert scale in order to answer the question. Brett, I'll try to describe it, and you tell me if I'm doing a good enough job. But the Likert scale is the type of rating scale used in quantitative survey type questions about attitude change, in which you could put forward a statement and ask someone, for example, if they strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, etc.
Yeah. Closed questions.
Brett, did that capture it in terms of what a Likert scale is in your?
Yeah, exactly.
So we definitely see those quantitative applications as sometimes a very useful complement to the OH exercise, right? We don't necessarily see them as part of the OH exercise because OH really is qualitative at its best, but we combine and mix and match complementary methods all the time. And we see that type of attitude change survey, whether it uses a Likert scale or a different technical mechanism, that type of attitude change survey can be really useful at a couple of different points in the process. Perhaps most importantly, toward the end of the process, if you want to get a sense of how many people have experienced a type of attitude change that arises frequently in your data. You know, like your qualitative OH data may tell you that there's a recurring pattern around a certain kind of attitude change that seems important, but you don't know how widespread that is within the community or the population that you are looking at. A survey is a great complementary way to explore that. And there are a few other complementary purposes of that type as well. Does that make sense, Brett?
Let's assume that as a yes.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, trying to find the mute button.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah, sorry, I get your time. There's questions from Stephen and then Connie. I see it coming in. Stephen's asking, I see outcome harvesting as being birthed in more Western-centric paradigms and thus still linear and mechanistic. I'm a farming kid, so harvesting was always in neat visible rows. Well, different special type of farming. Whereas attitude change gets a messy dynamic space related to the cognitive, sociological ecosystem surrounding any social change intervention. Is attitude change not trying to jam a round peg into a square hole? Well, that last part is very clear. Thank you, Stephen. A round peg into a square hole. And attitude change is being messy, dynamic, whereas outcome harvesting birth into more Western-centric paradigms. That's maybe up for debate in itself. Are you with the question, Michelle?
Yeah, I am. This is actually something we talk about a lot. And heads up, I'm actually going to ask if Min Ma wants to comment on this when I finish as well. So Min, you tell us yes or no. But this is actually something that we talk about a lot because we do see certain aspects of outcome harvesting or the ways in which we often do outcome harvesting to have some culturally Western aspects. And for some cultural groups would say that focusing only on behavior change while ignoring attitude change is one of those culturally Western aspects. Right. So in those circumstances, we actually see adding in the attitude change to bring a more holistic view to things as a way of moderating that Western leaning tendency or making the approach more culturally responsive. So I would say in that case, rather than jamming a round peg into a square hole or vice versa, it's improving the shape of the hole. But let me check. Min, do you want to comment on this? Min is our co-author and she's given it a lot of thought as well, just creating a little space.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree with what Michelle shared, making the whole a little bit better. And just connecting that back to the previous question about, sorry, I'm trying to find it. The previous question about like, what about those accepted methodologies like the Likert scale?
The Likert scale, yeah.
To me, I think it is helping us get at more relevant questions around assumptions and also looking at Allison's comment about that program staff are often building assumptions about the attitude change that are critical to the theories of change. So I see this as doing better. It's not perfect. And I think there are still a lot of Western ways of thinking baked into this. And even with my lens, I'm a person of color. I come from a different cultural background, but I'm still trained in Western ways of thinking. And so I'm sure there are flaws to it, but I also think it's creating a lot more space than a lot of other methods. And if it's helping us get at better Likert scale questions so that we're asking about the right attitude changes or the ones that we're hearing are coming up, then I think it's an improvement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Min. Okay, this brings us close to the top of the hour. So I would like to thank you all for your attention. And of course, you know that this will be posted online, all the recordings. There are 2 pending questions practically, and we might be able to answer them in the chat about whether there are additional examples of evaluation reports, public evaluation reports that exemplify outcome harvesting and attitude change. Perhaps we can do that in the chat or later share that in our forum. And Connie Rasman is asking, we sometimes rate the level of significance and the importance of the contribution. So I assume that we could also rate the strength of the attitude change. Is that happening? Anyway, that is a question. I invite you to respond it either now in the chat or we do that later by the just in our online forum. Barbara is making a comment, I think. Yeah, I see several comments about this being a brilliant session. So thank you very much, Michelle, Barbara, and Malaka. And there were some other nice comments also supporting the usefulness of this outcome harvesting and attitude change. A comment from Allison I saw, and another comment from Brett as well, really seeing the value of this approach. Time is not with us anymore, so I'd really want to stick to all your calendars and probably busy schedules, and hope to see you very soon. Somebody can say about our next webinar. We're July now, so the next one will be, from top of mind, mid-August. Jule, could you help, or Carmen?
It's Carmen.
Carmen, can you help our next?
Second half of August. Yeah, we're still defining the date, but there will be one
Yeah.
next month.
And
Yeah.
if I'm right, we were still debating which topic will take place then, right? So keep an eye on the forum, but we'll try to be good girls and inform you well in time. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for hosting, Connie.
Yeah,
great-
more than welcome. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone. This
Connie.
was so interesting. Oh my goodness, lots of
Yeah.
food for.
Happy having you. Yeah. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.